Uh, okay, so we're going to try this, this way of doing it. Let's see how it works. Oh, that won't work. Exit out. Okay, we'll just do this. Um, so where we left off on Friday was talking about some of the additional requirements that we put onto stationary sources beyond kind of what's inherent in the SIP or anything like that. And the big things we talked about was how this was a multi-factor trigger based on the kind of pollution you're discharging, where the source is, whether you're in an attainment area or a non-attainment area, whether the source is a new source or an existing source, and whether it's a major or a non-major source. So those are the factors that go into this multi-factor trigger. We talked briefly about the new sources and how new source can include major modifications, and the process of deciding if a new source is a new source or not is the new source review process. We talked about the exceptions to avoid new source review, um, and reasons why folks would want to do that, a kind of bias against new sources in terms of higher requirements, higher requirements for processing emissions in order to reduce emissions. And the ways that you avoid NSR that we talked about is routine maintenance, repair, and replacement exemption, and bubbling out. Then we moved into discussing non-attainment areas. As you probably already know, decided on a pollutant by pollutant basis. We talked a little bit about the requirements for what those areas have to have. And then we talked about what sources need to do in order to operate in non-attainment areas. We discussed RACT, the reasonably available control technologies, which is required for existing major sources, and then newer modified major sources get the lowest achievable emission rate, LAER. And recall that they have to have offsets, and the ratio varies by state, but usually it's above a 1-to-1 ratio, so 1.1, 1.2, maybe even 1.3, something along those lines. RACT again is the lowest emission limitation the particular source is capable of meeting by the application of control technologies reasonably available considering technological and economic feasibility. That's done on an industry-wide basis, not for the facility itself. And then LAER, which is a tighter basis, it's the most stringent categorical standard out there. I mean, the most stringent that's applied against an entire class of facilities. And it's either the most stringent one found in any SIP or the most stringent achieved in practice, whichever is more stringent. And the baseline for those is the new source standards of performance, the NSPS. Nothing can be lower than those. And we discussed this case. We kind of started on it in class on last week and then moved on without discussing it very much. So we spent some time on it Monday. The big things to note here are the requirements, the 5 requirements that the EPA looks at when it's trying to determine whether or not to allow an area to move back into an attainment designation. To look at the standard of review used in the case, which is arbitrary and capricious. And it's actually determined to be arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedures Act and not the Clean Air Act, even though the Clean Air Act usually is what's used for almost all of the other Clean Air Act review standards and rulemaking standards and all of those things. So generally the Clean Air Act controls, but this is kind of a special case. And so it does fall back to the Administrative Procedures Act. We also discussed the way the court kind of signaled early on in the case that, hey, the EPA would have to be wrong on all 5 of these factors, and not just wrong, they'd have to be arbitrary and capricious on all of those. It places a big burden on the plaintiff, and anytime the court leads with that, you kind of know the plaintiff is in bad shape. Pretty brief discussion of that case. And then on Friday or on Wednesday of last week, we talked about the air quality indexes, all these different health conditions and such, and we did the think, pair, share on air quality last week. So we moved into attainment areas then on Monday, and what the attainment areas here require is essentially that we don't degrade the air in attainment areas. These were added in 1977. The thought was in 1970 when we passed the Clean Air Act was that we just weren't going to have any problems with this, that air was just going to get cleaner, not dirtier. And so there was no real requirement in the act that would prevent attainment areas from getting closer to non-attainment. And clearly that didn't happen. So Congress addressed that 7 years later with these amendments. It creates the Prevention of Significant Deterioration Program, the PSD program. It allows some degradation of air quality. That amount that it allows is called the maximum allowable increase. And that's based on what class of area you're in. The tightest class is Class 1, national parks. Essentially, this protects areas where you don't want to see air quality get any worse. Places like the Grand Canyon, Mount Rushmore, basically places where the vista or the ability to see long distances is a big part of the appeal. And so we're trying to keep those areas as clean as they were, at least in 1977, and not let them get any dirtier. Class 2 is the default class. That's everything else. That means some degradation is allowed, although not to the point of a non-attainment zone. And then Class 3 is kind of the lowest quality class. The state can move areas into this class if the state wants to encourage industrial development, that kind of thing. So again, these aren't allowed to go out of attainment, but Class 3 gets kind of the closest to non-attainment. Existing sources and attainment areas don't have additional requirements, but we did discuss the new facilities and attainment areas. So PSD program designates different standards for major than what we read about kind of throughout the rest of the Act. So anything over 250 tons per year or 100 tons per year plus a special category, and we didn't do a whole lot of detail on that. And new for the PSD program means anything after August 7th, 1997. Permits for sources and attainment areas that are new sources, they have to show that the air quality region will not go out of the national ambient air quality standards, won't go out of attainment, and will not have more than the maximum allowable increase based on what kind of class it's in, Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3, as we discussed 2 slides ago. And the standard here that must be applied to these new sources is best available control technology, which is defined on as an emission limitation based on the maximum degree of reduction of each pollutant, which the permitting authority, I'm just reading this to you, sorry, on a case-by-case basis, taking into account energy, environmental, and economic impacts and other costs, determined is achievable for such facility through application of production processes and available methods, systems, and techniques. This is on a facility basis, so it's not applied to an entire category, just to the facility. The book says that this is more stringent than LAER, but in practice, my understanding is that it is not, in fact, generally more stringent. It's generally less stringent, which makes sense. You want to apply your LAER, your most stringent category, to new sources in non-attainment areas. And these are new sources in attainment areas, and so they're going to have a less stringent standard. We discussed, again, fairly briefly, the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation v. EPA case. This is an image of one of the generators that they're talking about in this case, just to give you an idea how big they are. Like, that's a full-size truck right there. So kind of a huge thing. These are 1, 2, 3, 4-story tall generators. So it's not some like little Honda generator that's running out back of the house. It's like a huge generator to run a mine off of. There's some interesting YouTube videos about the Red Dog mine that are kind of their PR pieces. So if you're interested, you can check those out. We watched one in class, but it's not must-know information. The question here in this case was essentially how much control does the EPA have over what the state determines to be backed? And as it turns out, the EPA has quite a lot of control. The EPA gets to make the final judgment call about whether a particular technology is backed for a given facility or not. So here, the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation wanted to allow a particular technology as backed, and the EPA overruled them, and the Supreme Court backed up that decision. I've summarized this case with, I find it very helpful, obviously, the acronyms here. So this is the shortest possible version I could create of this case using all of the relevant acronyms. D stands for defendant, P stands for plaintiff. I think everything else is self-explanatory here. All right, so the other thing with backed is that you essentially how this works, you rank all of the available control technologies from most effective to least effective, regardless of cost or anything. And then you start at the top, and that's the default backed, unless the applicant shows that the alternative is not achievable. And so if the burden is on the applicant to show that it doesn't work, and if the applicant's unable to show that, then that will become backed. If the applicant is able to show that it's not achievable, then you go to the next technology down, and the applicant has to show that that one's not achievable for some reason. The relevant factors here are technical considerations, energy, environmental, or economic impacts. So pretty wide open in terms of what can be considered. You just keep moving down the list. And then we talked about new source performance standards under Clean Air Act Section 111, the NSPS. These are the standards that apply everywhere to any new stationary source. And the requirement here is that you use the best available demonstrated technology, which is BADT or BDT. And you can see the definition there. The greatest degree of emission limitation achievable through application of the best technological system of continuous emission, which, taking into consideration the cost of achieving the emissions reduction in any non-air quality, health and environmental and energy requirements, has been adequately demonstrated. So it's not a super high bar. The other part of this that seems a little strange is where would this catch-all standard apply? If we've read about the other standards for new sources in attainment areas and in non-attainment areas, so why do we even need this? And the answer to that comes in Clean Air Act Section 111D, which allows for the regulation of existing sources of pollutants that are not criteria pollutants. So pollutants that aren't hazardous and pollutants that are not criteria pollutants on that short list that we discussed last week can still be regulated under Section 111. And where that comes up for us is greenhouse gases, or came up for us. It's not clear right now how much longer this will last. So the president's, Obama's Clean Power Plan, which is the carbon pollution standard for existing power plants and for new modified and reconstructed power plants, all of that was under Section 111, and that regulated pollutants that were not criteria pollutants. So CO2, methane, N2O, hexafluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluorides. So a whole bunch of different greenhouse gases. You may have seen yesterday Pruitt announced that the EPA administrator announced that today or tomorrow he's going to sign the proposed rule, a draft rule for comment that would revoke the Clean Power Plan. So this may not be in play much longer. Then we discussed these Title V operating permits, which essentially collects all of the requirements for any given source into one document. It's supposed to get everything together so that the regulated entities know exactly what it is they're supposed to do. These tend to be really long, really complicated. They're issued by the state, not by the feds, but it's just a very long process to get these issued. There's public participation, there's judicial review. These have to have the requirements are that they include enforceable emissions limitations, monitoring, and inspection provisions. And then these can be enforced through the citizen suit provision, which does have a 60-day notice of intent requirement. So operating permits, everybody has to have them, and it essentially says what any given source is subject to. And this is a nice chart from the book. It may be too small for you to see. It is on my screen. But take a look in the book and check this out. It has kind of the whole multi-figure test broken down into a chart. So kind of source, minor stationary, existing major, new major, and then different kinds of non-attainment areas and attainment areas, and what is required for all of those things. All right, so give that a read. Should be helpful. We discussed briefly the mobile sources. So EPA is allowed to develop standards for air pollutants from motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines. The EPA was not using this to address greenhouse gases until the Mass v. EPA case, which said that, well, number one, the EPA has authority to do it, and number two, the EPA has to do it. This created some conflicts between the EPA and the Department of Transportation because transportation has always done fuel economy, and for mobile sources, greenhouse gas emissions are tied pretty closely to fuel economy. They seem to have worked that out, but now when Department of Transportation does any new fuel economy regulation, they also do a piece with the EPA to address greenhouse gases. This also deals with essentially when we get our cars smogged, all the stuff they test for that's coming out of the tailpipe. This is where they get the authority, where the EPA has authority to do that. Generally, the feds do this and all the states follow along. But again, and you probably already know this, under the Clean Air Act Section 209, there's an exemption for states that already had standards when the Clean Air Act was passed. It's an optional exemption, so the EPA has to grant it, but the EPA has always granted California that exemption. So California has its own special requirements for vehicles. It's also where we get the authority in California to have special gas requirements. One of the reasons our gas is a little bit more expensive. So other states follow our lead, but that's the reason when you bring a car into California that you have to get that car smogged. And then last thing, we talked about the effectiveness of the Clean Air Act. It's one of the very most effective pieces of environmental legislation out there. If you want to talk about kind of clear wins for the environment, if you want to talk about really good environmental legislation, even though the Clean Air Act is super complicated, it has done really amazing things. And it's done them in a cost-effective way. So for every dollar you spend, you get $30 in benefits, and that's kind of the minimum amount. Some studies show a much higher benefit to cost ratio. So when people talk about the costs of complying with the Clean Air Act, the costs of environmental legislation, the Clean Air Act at least suggests that it's wildly beneficial. If you made 30 to 1 on all your investments, you'd be in really good shape. And not only has it been very cost effective, there's also been huge emission reductions and huge human health benefits. So we actually see real reductions in the amount of all of these pollutants from 1980 to 2012 in terms of millions of tons per year. So carbon monoxide, less than a third of what it was. Lead is what, 1-2 orders of magnitude lower, so way lower. Nitrogen oxides, NOx is about a third. VOCs are about a third. Particulate matter, tough nut to crack, but about a third. And then PM 2.5 is half what it was when we started measuring it. And then our SOx is less than a quarter of what it was. And so these are real reductions, which is significant given the trend lines on, say, vehicle miles traveled, which, as you know, has just gone up and up. Total GDP, which has gone up and up. Population, which has gone up and up. Number of cars on the road, which has gone up and up. So we have all of these things trending up. This is me showing an up trend line. And in spite of that up trend line, our pollutants are actually going down. So Clean Air Act has really been successful in reducing the amount of pollutants that's being emitted. And then if we look at the health impacts from that, we see really significant health impacts from that as well. So these are the reductions. Adult mortality down by 160,000 people per year, estimated to be down by 230,000 people per year by 2020. So 230,000 more people will be dying per year from breathing in particulate matter if the Clean Air Act had not been passed. Fewer with infants because infants don't breathe as much, they're younger, because they're healthier, all that stuff. But still avoiding infant deaths, quite a bit of ozone mortality, lots of bronchitis, lots of acute bronchitis avoided. Acute myocardial infarctions, that's heart attacks, are way down from what they would have been. Asthma exacerbations, way lower, 1.7 million avoided, 2.4 million avoided by 2020. Hospital admissions down quite a bit. Restricted activity days, school lost days, lost work days. So huge decreases in the health impacts due to air pollution, and that comes with a concomitant increase in productivity, since people are not having restricted activity days, not missing school days, and not missing work days. So really significant improvements there. And that was all we covered lecture-wise in class on Friday, or on Monday rather. I can't keep my days straight. On Monday. And then we went into the environmental justice lab, and there's no lecture that goes along with that. If you get that done and email it to me on Thursday or Friday, then I won't count that as late or anything. And I'm not grading it. It's more just to make sure people do it and learn the information in there. You probably are already familiar with the ArcGIS mapping tool, but if not, it's a great tool to use. So I'll try and actually record class on Wednesday today. I did not record the class on Monday, so I figured this was probably the best way to do it. I could just record class like this, or I could actually record it with a video of me, which might be less boring for you. So I'll email you and ask you about that. Hopefully this works, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.